Hi, my name's Phil. I'd like to talk about politics, and Britain's electoral system is broken. Now, lots of people claim this, but what does it actually mean? Well, the purpose of democracy is to have a government chosen by the people in a fair and transparent way, but this is not how the UK system works anymore. At the 2024 general election, Labour won 63.4% of all the seats in Parliament, giving it a massive majority to do pretty much whatever it likes. However, it only won 33.7% of the votes. If the seats in Parliament were distributed according to how people voted, then the government might well be a coalition of Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party. That would be a government you could say the majority voted for. Whereas we are being told that the government has a mandate to implement any budgets and laws it sees fit on the basis of a minority of votes. And this wasn't just the case at the last election. It has been the case for generations. Let's look at how voting behaviour has changed since the end of the Second World War. First of all, turnout. The percentage of eligible voters turning out for the general election has been declining over time across this period. There hasn't been a catastrophic collapse, but nonetheless, turnout has been declining. Last year's election saw the second lowest turnout during this 80-year post-war period. Even taking into account some voters being turned away due to a lack of voter ID, about 2 out of every 5 eligible voters decided to simply not bother. So why might this be? Well, there will always be some voters who do not want to engage with the process for whatever reason, even with more suitable electoral systems. But this next graph might give some indication. It's the combined vote share of the big 2 post-war parties, Labour and the Conservatives. Back in the early post-war period, the vast majority were voting for either Labour or the Conservatives. Over time, this share has declined as people have opted for other parties. This is what we call the fragmentation of the vote. A first-past-the-post system, of the sort we have for Westminster elections, works on the basis of asking voters to pick between 2 options. As soon as there are more than 2 viable options, it breaks down, as I'll be showing in a moment. And this fragmentation has not suddenly started happening. It has nothing to do with some of the more remarkable political revolutions we've been seeing in Britain recently. Indeed, some of the effects of the chaotic political developments are a direct consequence of the fact that over a period of decades, the percentage of voters using their vote for a party outside the big 2 has been increasing. There was always going to come a tipping point, and we have now reached that point. Before going over what's happening now that we've reached this tipping point, let's look at one more chart. This shows the difference between the winning government's vote share and the share of seats won in Parliament. A negative bar means that the winning party won a greater share of the seats than they did of the vote. A very negative bar means that the government won more power than the majority of voters wanted them to have. The positive bar in 2010 was the coalition of Liberal Democrats and Conservatives. They won over 50% of the vote, and as it happens, won a smaller share of the seats than their combined vote. But the only time we ever get a government that has representation of a majority of voters is when we have a coalition. For most of the first few decades of the post-war period, the deficit was below 10%. It's still negative, so the power of the government still exceeded the popular vote, but within tolerance. From the 1980s, it became routine for governments to win significant majorities in Parliament with a smaller share of the vote. 2024 was the absolute worst result for representative democracy. The share of the seats Labour won was not far off double their share of the vote. And what's more, because this is all part of a trend which has been happening for decades, it's not a one-off, it's going to keep happening. The pragmatic way to approach a first-past-the-post system where more than 2 parties compete is to decide which of the viable options you would prefer. This means not necessarily voting for your preferred candidate or party, but the preferred viable candidate or party. For example, you might be a supporter of the Green Party, but the constituency you are voting in will realistically be a contest between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives. If you vote for the Green Party, your vote will not be used to determine the winner of the contest. Only by voting for one of the candidates with a realistic chance, in this case either Lib Dem or Conservative, can you use your vote to determine the balance of power in the House of Commons. This is called tactical voting. We saw a lot of tactical voting against the Conservatives at the last election. However, tactical voting is just a sticking plaster approach to an electoral system which does not allow your vote to count, and most do not vote tactically. For example, in 2024, both the Green Party and Reform UK were the big losers from the first past the post system. Their share of the vote compared to their share of the seats was appalling, and yet this was also expected. Between them, the Greens and Reform UK won 21.1% of the vote. That's just over 1 out of every 5 votes cast. But they only won 1.4% of the seats, and this was in line with polling expectations. We know from post-election polling that the vast majority of these voters voted for their preferred party despite not expecting that candidate to stand any chance at all. There will have been people voting for the other parties despite them standing no chance of winning around the country as well. So the proportion of voters now willing to vote quite consciously for parties or candidates knowing they have no chance of success is so great that the system has basically collapsed. Just to put some figures to this concept, from the 2024 general election, there were just over 48 million eligible voters, but just under 29 million took part. So straight away, 19 million people over were eligible to vote but did not do so. Of the 29 million who did vote, 12 million voted for a winning candidate. So more people voted for a losing candidate and therefore got nothing for their vote than voted for a winning candidate. But 9 million people voted for a candidate who was neither the winner nor even the runner-up. That's almost a third. Almost 1 in 3 votes cast were cast for a candidate that didn't even stand a realistic chance of winning. And although it will be true that some voters may have cast those votes without realising that their candidate couldn't possibly win, most are likely to have done so fully aware that their vote was not going to influence the end result. That's a lot of people who are engaging with the voting process because they turned out to vote, but they're not engaging with the electoral process because they know that vote isn't going to determine any elections. It is possible to win a large majority of the seats in Parliament with a small share of the vote now. There are now 3 parties who are capable of doing that. We have a first past the post system which works on the basis of 2 clear choices, but now have 3 parties capable of polling at the share of the vote needed to win a majority, with 4 further parties in Britain capable of winning significant shares of the votes where they stand as well. We already have some seats being won with as little as 25% of the vote. This puts us into dangerous territory. The hegemony which existed for generations, that is the dominance of Labour and the Conservatives, has already ended. It is true, we have not yet seen a government which is not dominated by one of those 2 parties, but the state of politics now is such that it is only a matter of time. We no longer have 2 dominant parties and some smaller parties picking off a few votes and seats here and there. In future elections, because the vote is split 5 ways in England and 6 in Scotland and Wales, we might see lots of individual seats won with very small minorities. This means that a party which can do this in lots of seats, winning by small margins, could win a majority with only 30% of the vote. The unprecedented deficit between vote share and seat share for Labour at the last election need not be a one-off. It's actually likely to become the norm, where the outright winner of an election, assuming any one party does so, can win on such small vote shares, or even less, because Labour won a massive majority, far greater than they needed. They could have won significantly fewer votes still and a workable majority. One crucial factor in any discussion around public engagement in politics is the power of the voice. Democracy is supposed to be the vehicle through which members of the public can make their voices known. Some people want their voice to be heard quite loudly and will help with campaign or protest groups, perhaps stand for election themselves, or maybe become commentators on a mainstream or social media platform. Some people may instead write to their elected representatives to air their views, and most see their vote as an expression of those views. But first past the post increasingly means that these voices are lost. In the past, a government which won power on the strength of 45% of the vote was not representing the majority. However, many of their policies would still individually enjoy broad support from some other on the opposition benches, even if it wasn't quite how they would do it. But the lower vote share needed to win power in Parliament now means This is less likely. It is less likely that your major policies do in fact have majority voter support. We have found ourselves in a position whereby a government can pass laws which are actually opposed by the majority of voters. Let's take a hypothetical case of three major parties vying to form a government. The Porridge Party, which thinks everyone should eat porridge for breakfast, the Toast Party, who think everyone should have toast, and the Asparagus Party, who think everyone should have asparagus for breakfast. So people vote according to which food they think the government should force everyone else to eat for breakfast. Let's say each party gets roughly 30% of the vote, with the other 10% going to other parties like, the Cornflakes Party or something. Now let's imagine that most people might have a preference for either porridge or toast, but wouldn't be too bothered with the other choice. But they all positively hate asparagus. In a first past the post system, the Asparagus Party, if it concentrates its votes very efficiently in key marginals with a very good election strategy, could easily win a majority of seats in Parliament, forcing the entire country to eat asparagus for breakfast with 30% of the vote, even though 70% of the people rate it as their most hated option. This outcome is only possible with first past the post, and it's quite dangerous because as people see this happening, they begin to feel that not only does their own vote not matter, but the votes of the majority don't matter. And when that happens, you lose faith in democracy altogether. It makes it easier for insidious groups to take power through democratic means because of the majority of people, or even a large minority of people, disengaging from the process altogether. And that removes features of democracy. This is because once people lose faith in their democracy, they will not fight as hard to defend it. And if this sounds alarmist, we have seen it happen in Western countries time and again. It has happened in the most powerful democracies in the world. It can happen anywhere. The importance of letting people feel that their democracy is responsive to their voice is very important if you want people to fight for it. One of the main platforms a populist group adopts is to pretend they are giving voice to the disenfranchised, a technique which only works when people feel disenfranchised. It is why any democracy, no matter the system, must always be conscious of the need to make people feel they have a way of expressing their views. So how would a representative system address these issues? Well, in the first instance, it would be impossible for any one party to win majority power unless they win a majority of the votes. This leads to two advantages. The first is it would be all but impossible for a minority of voters to impose something on the nation that the majority were opposed to. The second is that because realistically no single party is likely to win a majority, the likely coalition government which forms will act to counter some of the dumber decisions that governments make from time to time. In a single party government, the leadership announces policies and their legislators, MPs in the case of Westminster, generally back it. Even if the policy sounds insane, they will generally back it out of a sense of party loyalty or simply the belief that the big guns have run the numbers and know what they're doing. We've seen this go badly wrong for both the Conservatives and Labour in recent times. Whereas in a coalition, if the ministry in one party has a brain fart, the MPs in the other party are much more inclined to critically query the wisdom of the policy. It removes a level of blinkered tribal acceptance of policies where critical thinking should be employed. It removes a level of groupthink from the policy making. Groupthink being where everyone in a group has a very unified way of thinking because they came from largely similar backgrounds and doesn't include those with different perspectives into the group. This means that ideas are less likely to be challenged until they're announced, by which time it's too late to prevent the damage being done. But MPs from different parties are more naturally critical of one another, even if they can still do so respectfully working together in coalition. But most importantly, the government will represent a majority of voters. A government which represents a small majority will not have as much power, so will be unable to pursue some of the more controversial policies because rebels would stop them. A party able to push more controversial policies will need a larger share of the vote collectively, that it can be said to have a clear mandate from the public. A representative parliament, and therefore government, means that people can see their voice in action. Their vote may not get the result they want, but they will see that the majority did win the election. The majority will always win the election in a way which they almost never do with our current system. So what are some practical ways of achieving this? Well, there are two general forms which could be considered, with a hybrid of the two having some appeal. Proportional representation is the system which most cite in regards to electoral reform. The country would be split up into regions, and although there are various ways to achieve this, seats allocated roughly in proportion to vote share. Without going into the maths of the D'Hondt system, the most popular way of allocating seats, it is a system which means that votes are less likely to be wasted. If this is done across the country, then the percentage of seats in Parliament for each party will match very closely the vote share as well. It does still allow for independent MPs to stand and win. So what are the pros and cons? Well, the pros are that it will produce the closest match between vote share and seat share, but there are some downsides. The first is it can encourage lots of small parties to emerge, fighting on narrow policy platforms, which makes forming a stable coalition much more difficult. This can be avoided by having 5% minimum vote shares. So the way this could work in the UK, for example, is you need to get 5% of the vote across all the regions where you are standing in order to be able to win any seats. So the SNP, for example, would need 5% of the vote in Scotland, not across the UK, because they only stand candidates in Scotland. But a party standing candidates across the UK would need 5% of the vote across the UK. It would discourage parties from standing in regions they stand no prospect of winning in, and avoid flooding the ballot sheet with too many choices, and also encourage parties to have broader platforms needed for overlap with coalition partners. Another downside is there wouldn't be constituencies. Now, this is likely to be a game loser in Britain because people value constituency MPs. However, this may be where the hybrid system comes in. Another option is a transferable vote system, such as the AV system proposed by the Liberal Democrats for the 2011 referendum. In this system, you do not have just one vote. You rank candidates in order of preference. For example, you might be asked to rank your top 3 candidates. The idea is there are a series of runoffs with the counting. The candidate with the lowest vote share is eliminated, and their votes are assigned to the others according to their second choice preferences. As this process continues, where both the first and second choice have been eliminated, the third choice votes are assigned. Only when all 3 of your choices have been eliminated is your vote worthless. And this process continues until one candidate gets over half of the votes. The advantages to this system is that it wouldn't require a major change to the structure of Parliament or constituencies. It would simply require you to put numbers in your ballot paper against the names of 2 or 3 candidates usually, instead of a cross or tick by 1. This lack of a need to change very much with our current system is appealing to some people. However, there are downsides as well. Although it produces a much more representative system than first past the post, where more votes count, it is not as representative as proportional representation. But it has the advantage of maintaining the constituency system exactly as it is now. Another downside is it would take much longer to declare winners, as votes are redistributed from eliminated candidates. However, it is also possible to run a hybrid system. This is quite common, is known as proportional representation with top-up members. The idea is you elect MPs in 2 ways. There's a regional list, which is your proportional representation element, and then there is the vote for your constituency MP. This means you have both MPs elected for your region, as we used to do for the EU parliamentary elections, but you also have a constituency MP as well. This is how MSPs are elected in the Scottish Parliament. However, the constituency MPs, which form the majority, are still elected via first past the post, and so the seat allocation does not match the vote share. One solution could be to decide the constituency MPs using the AV system. This way you could eliminate first past the post completely. Both regional and constituency MPs would be selected by methods designed to more closely match vote share with parliamentary power, which is an essential component in having a government which reflects at least majority public opinion. But one criticism often levelled at proportional representation is that it also allows narrow interest parties to win power, that it allows extremism. But this is untrue. On the contrary, it prevents extremists coming to power, unless, of course, the majority suddenly find extremism popular. For example, in the Netherlands' most recent election, people cited the election of Geert Wilders' party into government. However, Wilders himself does not head up the government, and his party had to temper many of their more extreme policies in order to work with their coalition partners. They won nowhere near enough seats to hold power, only share it, but in a first-past-the-post system, they could have run the government. We have already seen that with the British system, you can win a massive majority with less than 34% of the vote. So you could win a reasonable majority with 30% of the vote, maybe less. It's very unlikely that a party with an extreme agenda could win over half of the vote. But in politically or economically turbulent times, they can win with about 30% of the vote. It is completely incorrect to say that PR helps extreme groups take power. It actually makes it very difficult for them to do so. And this isn't the only fallacy about proportional systems as well. Some believe that first past the post is the only way to have a stable government. This is based on the notion that because representative systems are likely to need coalitions to form governments, inter-party fighting can lead to governments collapsing. But this is not that common. Whereas in a first-past-the-post system, where you have multiple viable parties, as we now do in Britain, we are more likely to see unstable governments. Look at what first-past-the-post has done in the UK over the past decade. The last stable government we had was from 2010 to 2015, and that was a coalition government. Since then, the government of 2015 lasted just 2 years. The one afterwards lasted only 2.5 years. The following one lasted almost the full 5 years, but burned through 3 different prime ministers in the space of 2 months. And now the current government, with its massive majority, has crashed in the polls in a pretty unprecedented way. First past the post is not delivering stable governments at all. It's stable only whilst the vast majority of people vote for just 2 parties. As soon as that is no longer the case, you end up with very unstable governments, as we have seen for a whole decade now. And that is not going to end. So are we any closer to adopting a representative electoral system, which we should have adopted many years ago? Well, there are a lot of MPs across multiple parties pushing for this. The government and shadow government are not the only organised groups of MPs in Parliament. Other MPs often form special interest groups called APPGs, or all-party parliamentary groups. One of these APPGs is called the Group for Fair Elections and has 3 main aims to make elections fairer, including electoral reform to go along with policies to remove corrupt money from politics and tackle misinformation. The Fair Elections APPG is the largest in Parliament. Put simply, it can be said to be the most important individual issue which backbench MPs want to push for. There's a recognition that our electoral system is now dangerously unstable. We've already had a decade of unstable governments, and experts are clear that the current multi-party system cannot function alongside a system which is designed for a 2-party hegemony. We're not going through a little phase or a blip. This is now part and parcel of the way people are voting. There are lots of reasons to argue for electoral reform on fairness grounds. It's fundamentally unfair that certain types of voter are more important than others. It means that policies often heavily favour one group of voters and actively punishes another. The moral arguments for a fairer, more inclusive system have been around for decades. But there is now an urgent need to deal with the issue because the system cannot function. We're going to lurch from completely incompatible policies every few years. A first-past-the-post system where 7 different parties are all competing strongly is a very different beast to the system we had for generations. The problem, as always, is that a system of electoral reform has to be initiated by the government, and governments tend not to want to tinker with a system which puts them in power. After all, they will need to completely rework their strategies to win with a different system. However, those time-tested strategies are already failing because the system has already changed. A first-past-the-post system with 7 major parties is fundamentally different in nature to a first-past-the-post system with only 2 major parties, and the results demonstrate this. The system is now considered by experts to be little better than gambling for campaign managers. At the very least, we might just end up with a carousel of government changes as the electorate become more and more frustrated. The Labour Party one election, Reform UK the next, the Conservative Party back again after that, and then restart the entire process as each new government is seen to have failed and is replaced at the following election because it now only takes a relatively small number of voters to change their mind and you get a very different government. There is nothing stable about our current system. It used to be stable, albeit unfair. Now it is both unfair and chaotic. So although it has in the past been the case that no government would want to risk changing the system which gave them power, now the greater risk is in not changing it. To not change it invites further instability, meaning that the party with the best strategy or argument is not guaranteed to win. Now, some may think that despite the very fragmented nature of the vote at the last election, the most fragmented in Westminster history, we still ended up with one party winning a large majority, forming what should be a very stable government. So the problems I'm highlighting are overblown. However, the story of the 2024 election was a story of multiple factors all converging together to create that result. These stars align. Those factors are not going to align very often, and they were, first, Labour being very focused on key voters and concentrating their main messages to appeal to them. Labour, along with a lot of political parties, are rarely focused on election strategy. They just sort of make it up as they go along. Second, they were the only alternative to a very unpopular Conservative government, which was having a crisis of identity, presiding over economic upheaval, and had been in power for 14 years without having anything to show for it. Third, there was a large and well-organised campaign of specifically anti-Conservative tactical voting across the country. And fourth, Reform UK emerged to split the Conservative vote. And although Labour won a very large majority, it was with very small margins of the vote in many seats because it was with a very small share of the vote. These factors will not be as strong at the next election or most future elections. There will not be a long-serving incumbent in place to unite voters against. There is less likely to be as much tactical voting. Reform UK may not be so much splitting the Conservative vote as taking it. The 2024 results, down to a combination of factors, is not going to align together next time or the time after. They may do every generation or so, but there will be political chaos in between. Indeed, those aligning factors were motivated by the political chaos that we were experiencing at the time. Only an electoral system which takes account of the way people want to vote will return stability to the system. So what would the process of electoral reform look like? Well, Labour presented their official position on the issue in 2023. They said the flaws in the current voting system are contributing to the distrust and alienation we see in politics, but there is no consensus for a new system. Any proposed change to our voting system must be carefully thought through. It cannot be dictated by political leaders or forced upon the country from the top down. So essentially, Labour's formal position is that first past the post is damaging to politics, but that they should not tell the country which system to replace it with. That means there will have to be some form of public consultation. This consultation and debate would, of course, have to be set up by the government because it won't just spontaneously happen of its own accord. So in terms of giving the process a little push, you could contact your MP to ask them to raise the issues. You could ask your MP, unless they are a minister or shadow minister, if they are a member of the Fair Elections APPG, and if not, why not? You could also support the various groups who are campaigning for electoral reform, including Make Votes Matter, the Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform, or the Movement Forward. If we are ever to have political stability again, it is absolutely vital that people feel that the electoral system works for them. The chaos we're seeing at the moment is a direct result of a disconnect between the public and their own democracy. People will fight for something they value, and right now, too few value our political system. And if people won't fight to defend our politics, it will be vulnerable to those who would take advantage of it for their own selfish needs. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already done so. Have a great day, and until next time, I'll see you later.